They locked me out of my own sister's wedding in 34-degree weather, and for a moment, I honestly thought it had to be a mistake. I stood there on the stone steps of the venue, my gloved hand still half raised from knocking, staring at the heavy wooden doors that had just been closed in my face. The wind cut through my wool coat like it wasn't even there, slipping beneath the collar, brushing against my neck with a sharp, unforgiving chill. Inside, I could hear the faint echo of laughter, the soft swell of music, the low hum of a celebration that I was supposed to be part of. I took a slow breath and told myself to stay calm. There had to be a mix-up. There always was, in families like ours, small misunderstandings, crossed wires, things that could be fixed with a polite word and a patient smile. My name is Margaret Collins, I'm 68 years old, and I've spent most of my life believing that if you showed up for people, they would show up for you. I had shown up for my sister Rachel more times than I could count. I'd shown up when her first marriage fell apart, when she needed a place to stay, when she called me at 2 a.m. because she couldn't stop crying. And today, I had shown up early, dressed in a navy blue dress I'd spent 2 weeks choosing, with a gift carefully wrapped and tucked under my arm, ready to watch her start over again. I stepped closer to the door and knocked once more, a little firmer this time. A young man in a black suit cracked it open just enough to look at me, his expression polite but guarded. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said, glancing down at a tablet in his hand. "This is a private event." I gave a small, patient smile. "I understand. I'm Margaret Collins. I'm the bride's sister." He hesitated, then looked back at the screen, scrolling quickly. The pause stretched just a second too long. "I don't see your name on the list," he said finally. The words landed softly, but they hit harder than the cold. I felt it settle somewhere deep in my chest, a quiet weight that didn't quite make sense yet. "That can't be right," I said, keeping my voice even. "There must be another list." I helped organize some of the arrangements myself. He shifted slightly, uncomfortable now, and glanced over his shoulder as if hoping someone else would step in and handle it. "I can check with the coordinator," he offered, but he didn't move. I nodded, still smiling, still calm. "Please do." He closed the door again, leaving me alone on the steps. I stood there, listening to the muffled music on the other side, the kind of soft piano melody that was meant to feel elegant and warm. It sounded distant now, like something playing in another life. I adjusted the scarf around my neck and looked out across the parking lot, where a few late arrivals hurried inside, their heels clicking against the pavement, their laughter carried briefly on the wind before the doors swallowed them. No one looked at me twice. No one noticed that I hadn't been let in. I checked my watch. The ceremony was supposed to start in 10 minutes. I had been early on purpose. Rachel always hated when people were late. I remembered her saying that just a week ago, her voice light, almost teasing. "Don't be late this time, Maggie. You know how I feel about that." I had smiled then, promised her I'd be there ahead of schedule. And I was. I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Just not where she wanted me. The door opened again, and this time it was a woman with a clipboard, her smile practiced and tight. "Mrs. Collins?" she asked. "Yes," I replied, stepping forward slightly, relief flickering in my chest. "There's been a bit of confusion," she said quickly, not quite meeting my eyes. "The guest list was finalized yesterday. If your name isn't on it, I'm afraid I can't let you in." I felt the words settle, piece by piece, like something cold and precise clicking into place. "You're saying my sister removed me?" I asked quietly. She hesitated just long enough to answer without actually saying the words. "I'm sorry," she said instead. That was when I understood. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a mix-up or a forgotten detail. It was a decision. I looked past her shoulder, through the narrow gap in the door, and caught a glimpse of soft lighting, white flowers, rows of chairs filled with people who had been invited to witness something I had helped make possible. Then the door closed again, and the sound disappeared. I stood there for a moment longer, the cold pressing in, the silence settling around me. Then I let out a slow breath, tightened my grip on the gift in my hand, and smiled. Because in that moment, something inside me shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough. Enough to understand that whatever was happening behind those doors wasn't the beginning of the story. It was the end of something else. And I was no longer standing outside by accident. I did not knock again after that. There was no point. Instead, I stepped back from the door and moved to the side of the building where the wind was slightly less brutal, though not by much. The stone wall behind me held the cold like it had been storing it all day, and when I leaned against it, I could feel it seep through my coat, steady and unyielding. I set the gift down carefully on the ledge beside me, smoothing the ribbon with my gloved fingers as if that small act of order could somehow steady everything else. Inside, the music shifted, growing a little louder for a moment as someone opened a door further down the hallway, then fading again. A ripple of laughter followed, warm and effortless, the kind that comes from people who feel welcome. I closed my eyes briefly and pictured the room I had helped design just weeks ago. White hydrangeas lining the aisle, soft gold accents on the chairs, the exact shade Rachel had insisted on after rejecting 3 other options. I had sat with her at her kitchen table, going over samples, adjusting details, making sure everything felt perfect. She had reached across the table at one point and squeezed my hand, her smile bright, her voice soft. "I could not have done this without you, Maggie." I remember believing her. I opened my eyes and looked at the closed doors again, seeing them now not as a barrier but as a statement. This was not about space or capacity or some last-minute adjustment. This was intentional. Deliberate. Thought through. I pulled my phone from my purse, the screen lighting up against the gray afternoon, and for a moment I simply held it, feeling its weight in my hand. My reflection stared back at me in the dark glass, faint and distorted, a woman standing outside her own sister's wedding with nowhere to go. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it, but the sound never quite made it out. Instead, I scrolled through my messages, stopping at Rachel's name. The last text she had sent me was from 2 nights ago. "Everything is set. I cannot wait to see you there." I read it twice, then a third time, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something that made sense. They did not. The wind picked up again, tugging at my scarf, brushing loose strands of my silver hair across my face. I tucked them back slowly, my fingers steady now, more steady than I expected them to be. There was a time when something like this would have undone me, when I would have knocked until someone answered, raised my voice, demanded an explanation. But standing there, with the cold pressing in and the truth settling into place, I found that I did not have the energy for that kind of scene. Not anymore. A group of guests approached from the far end of the walkway, their voices bright, their steps quick against the cold. As they passed me, one of them glanced in my direction, her smile faltering just slightly as her eyes flicked from my face to the closed doors and back again. Recognition without understanding. Curiosity without involvement. Then she turned away and followed the others inside. The doors opened just long enough for a burst of warmth and light to spill out, along with the faint scent of flowers and something sweet, before closing once more. I watched it happen, that brief glimpse of everything I had been excluded from, and felt something inside me grow very still. Not broken. Not even particularly hurt in the way I might have expected. Just still. As if a line had been drawn and I had finally seen it clearly. I picked up the gift from the ledge and held it for a moment, weighing it in my hands. It was a delicate thing, chosen with care, meant to celebrate a new beginning. Slowly, I set it back down. There were some things that no longer needed to be given. I unlocked my phone and scrolled to another contact, one I had not needed to call in quite some time. My thumb hovered over the name for a second before I pressed it. The line rang once, then twice, before a familiar voice answered, calm and measured. "Daniel Brooks speaking." I smiled then, a small, quiet smile that did not reach my eyes but did not need to. "Daniel," I said, my voice even, steady, as if I were calling about something entirely ordinary. "It is Margaret Collins. I believe it is time we revisit those arrangements we discussed." There was a brief pause on the other end, just long enough for understanding to settle in. "Of course," he replied. "Are you ready to proceed?" I looked back at the doors one last time, at the place where I had been told I did not belong, and felt the last of my hesitations slip away. "Yes," I said softly. "I think I am." The wind moved around me again, but it no longer felt quite as sharp. I slipped my phone back into my purse, straightened my coat, and stepped away from the wall. Behind those doors, the ceremony was about to begin, everything unfolding exactly as planned. But not everything had been accounted for. Not quite. I did not wait to see how the ceremony unfolded. I walked down the stone steps slowly, my heels steady against the cold ground, each step measured, deliberate, as if I had somewhere important to be, even though I had nowhere to go. The parking lot stretched out in front of me, a quiet contrast to the warmth and celebration happening just a few yards away. Cars were lined up neatly, their windows reflecting the dull gray sky, their interiors empty and still. I reached my car and paused for a moment before unlocking it, my hand resting lightly on the handle as I looked back one last time at the building. From the outside, it looked perfect. Elegant. Exactly as Rachel had wanted. No one passing by would ever guess what had just happened on those steps. I opened the door and slid into the driver's seat, closing it gently behind me. The silence inside the car felt different from the silence outside. Softer. More contained. I placed my purse on the passenger seat and sat there for a moment, my hands resting in my lap, my breathing slow and even. Then I reached forward and turned the key in the ignition. The engine started with a low hum, and warm air began to push through the vents, gradually replacing the cold that had settled into my bones. I did not turn on the radio. I did not check my phone. I simply sat there, watching the entrance through the windshield as guests continued to arrive, unaware of anything beyond their own evening plans. After a minute, I shifted the car into reverse and backed out of the parking space, my movements smooth, practiced, the kind that come from years of repetition. I drove away without hesitation, without looking back again, merging onto the quiet road that led away from the venue. The world outside felt strangely ordinary. Streetlights flickered on as the late afternoon slipped into evening, casting a soft glow over the sidewalks and storefronts. A couple walked past a small cafe, their hands linked, their laughter visible even from a distance. Life continued unaffected, indifferent to the small, private fracture that had just taken place. I drove for a while without a destination, letting the rhythm of the road settle my thoughts. The call with Daniel lingered in my mind, his calm voice, the quiet certainty in his words. We had spoken about those arrangements months ago, in a different context, when everything still felt intact. At the time, it had seemed like a precaution, something responsible, something practical. Now, it felt like something else entirely. Something necessary. I stopped at a red light and glanced at the dashboard clock. The ceremony would be starting right about now. Rachel would be walking down the aisle, her dress perfect, her smile carefully arranged, every detail unfolding just as she had planned. Every detail except one. I exhaled slowly and looked ahead as the light turned green. Instead of heading home, I turned right, steering toward a quiet part of town where the streets were lined with older buildings, their brick facades worn but dignified. I pulled into a small parking lot and turned off the engine, the sudden silence settling around me once again. The sign on the building in front of me read Brooks & Associates, the gold lettering understated but unmistakable. I stepped out of the car, the cold air meeting me again, though it no longer felt quite as sharp. Inside, the office was warm and softly lit, the faint scent of coffee lingering in the air. Daniel was already waiting, standing near the front desk with a folder in his hand. He offered me a small, respectful nod as I approached, his expression calm but attentive. "Margaret," he said gently. I returned the nod, my posture straight, my voice steady. "I did not think I would need to come in today," I said, removing my gloves slowly, placing them neatly in my purse. "But here we are." He gestured toward his office, and I followed him inside, taking a seat across from his desk. The room was quiet, insulated from the outside world, from the music, the laughter, the carefully constructed illusion of celebration happening just a few miles away. Daniel opened the folder and placed a set of documents in front of me, his movements precise, unhurried. "Everything is prepared," he said. "Once you sign, the changes will take effect immediately." I looked down at the papers, the legal language familiar, the implications clear. For a moment I let my gaze rest there, taking in the weight of what I was about to do. Not out of hesitation, but out of understanding. Then I reached for the pen. I held the pen between my fingers for a moment longer than necessary, not because I was uncertain, but because I wanted to feel the exact point where everything shifted from intention to action. The paper in front of me was crisp, the ink already printed, the language precise in a way that left no room for misunderstanding. Daniel sat across from me, quiet and composed, giving me the space to decide without pressure, though we both knew the decision had already been made long before I walked into his office. I lowered the pen and signed my name carefully, each letter deliberate, steady, unchanged despite everything that had happened in the past hour. Margaret Collins. It looked the same as it always had, but it did not feel the same. I moved to the next page, and then the next, signing where indicated, initialing where required, the process unfolding. With a calm efficiency that felt almost detached from the emotion behind it. When I finished, I set the pen down gently and slid the documents back toward him. Daniel nodded once, acknowledging the finality of it, and began organizing the papers into the folder again. "I will have these filed immediately," he said. "The transfers will be processed within the hour." I inclined my head slightly. "That is sooner than I expected." "Given the circumstances," he replied, "I thought it would be best not to delay." I understood what he meant. Timing mattered. Not in a dramatic sense, but in a precise, quiet way that determined who held control and who did not. I leaned back slightly in the chair, allowing myself a small breath, the kind that comes after a long stretch of holding everything in place. "Do you remember when we first discussed this?" I asked, my voice soft but steady. Daniel paused for a moment, considering. "You said you wanted to ensure that your contributions were protected," he replied. "That everything you had built would remain under your discretion." I nodded. "I remember thinking it was excessive," I said. "I remember thinking that family would make it unnecessary." I let the thought settle between us, not as a complaint, but as a simple statement of fact. Daniel did not respond immediately, and I appreciated that. Some truths did not require commentary. Outside the office, the world continued in its usual rhythm. Cars passed by, their headlights casting brief lines of light across the window. Somewhere in the distance, a siren sounded and then faded, another life unfolding, another story entirely separate from mine. I reached for my purse and slipped my gloves back on, smoothing them over my hands with the same quiet care I had shown earlier with the ribbon on the gift I had left behind. That detail lingered in my mind for a moment, the image of it sitting alone on the cold stone ledge, untouched, unnecessary. "There is one more thing," Daniel said, drawing my attention back. He opened the folder again and removed a smaller document, sliding it across the desk toward me. "This will notify the relevant parties once the changes are confirmed." "It is standard procedure." I glanced down at the page, recognizing the format immediately. It was formal, concise, and unmistakable in its intent. A notification. Not an explanation. Not an apology. Just a statement of what had been done. "They will receive this tonight?" I asked. "Yes," he said. "Electronically and by courier." I allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible smile. Not out of satisfaction in the way one might expect, but out of clarity. Things were moving forward now, whether anyone inside that venue understood it yet or not. I stood, adjusting my coat, the fabric settling neatly around me, as if it had always been meant to sit this way. Daniel rose as well, offering a polite nod. "If you need anything further, you know how to reach me," he said. "I do," I replied. I turned and walked toward the door, my steps unhurried, my posture straight, The weight that had once felt uncertain now firmly anchored in something else entirely. When I stepped back outside, the air was still cold, but it no longer seemed to reach me in the same way. Across town, in a room filled with light and music, Rachel was likely standing at the front of the aisle, surrounded by people who believed they were witnessing the beginning of something beautiful. They would see the dress, the flowers, the carefully chosen words. They would not see the foundation shifting beneath it all. Not yet. I walked back to my car, opened the door, and paused for just a second before getting in, my hand resting briefly on the frame. Then I smiled, a quiet, composed smile that belonged entirely to me, and stepped inside, closing the door behind me with a soft, final click. I did not start the car right away. Instead, I sat there with my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, watching the faint reflection of the streetlights stretch across the windshield as evening settled fully into night. There was a stillness inside me now, a kind of quiet that only comes after something has been decided completely. Not rushed, not emotional, but resolved. I reached into my purse and took out my phone, unlocking it slowly, my movements unhurried. For a brief moment, I considered turning it off entirely, letting whatever was about to unfold happen without interruption. But I did not. Some things are better observed in real time, even if you choose not to respond. The first notification came less than 10 minutes later. A simple vibration in my hand, subtle but unmistakable. I glanced down at the screen. An email. Then another. Then a message. The sequence was predictable, almost procedural, like watching a set of dominoes fall in perfect order. Daniel had not exaggerated when he said everything would move quickly. I opened the first message, my eyes scanning the formal language with ease. Confirmation of filing. Execution of revised agreements. Immediate effect. Each line was concise, precise, leaving no room for interpretation. I closed the email and leaned back slightly in my seat, exhaling softly as I looked out into the quiet street again. Somewhere across town, the ceremony would be ending, guests rising from their seats, music shifting into something brighter, more celebratory. Conversations would begin, glasses would be raised, and Rachel would be smiling, believing that everything was exactly as it should be. My phone vibrated again, this time with a name that made me pause for just a second. Rachel. I let it ring once. Twice. 3 times. Then it stopped. A voicemail notification appeared almost immediately after. I did not open it. Not yet. Instead, I placed the phone face down on the passenger seat and let the silence return. It did not last long. Another call came in, this one from a number I did not immediately recognize, followed by a second attempt from Rachel, and then a third. The pattern was changing now. The calm structure of notifications giving way to something more urgent, less controlled. I could picture it without seeing it. The moment when someone notices something is wrong. The shift in tone. The quiet questions that turn into louder ones. The realization that what seemed secure was not as stable as it appeared. I reached over and picked up the phone again, this time opening the voicemail. Rachel's voice filled the car, no longer soft or carefully composed. It was tight, strained, each word pressed out too quickly. Margaret, I do not know what you have done, but I am getting messages about accounts, about payments being halted. This has to be a mistake. Call me back immediately. I listened to it once, then ended the playback without replaying it. There was no need. The message had said everything it needed to say. I set the phone back down and looked ahead, my gaze steady, my breathing even. A few seconds later, another notification appeared. This time it was a text message, the words appearing on the screen one line at a time. Margaret, what is going on? They are telling me the venue has not been fully paid. The coordinator is asking questions. Please call me. I watched the message settle on the screen, then fade slightly as the phone dimmed. The timing was exact. The sequence unfolding exactly as Daniel had outlined, each step triggering the next, each action leading to a consequence that could not be easily undone. I reached forward and turned the key in the ignition again, the engine responding with a low, steady hum. Warm air filled the car once more, though I barely noticed it now. I shifted into drive and pulled out of the parking lot, the tires rolling smoothly over the pavement as I merged back onto the road. The night had deepened, the sky a dark, even stretch above me, the city lights scattered like small, distant signals. My phone continued to vibrate intermittently, each notification another thread being pulled loose from the fabric Rachel had so carefully arranged. I did not answer. I did not respond. I simply drove, my hands steady on the wheel, my expression calm, as the space between what had been and what was about to be grew wider with every passing mile. I slowed the car as I approached the intersection near the main road that led back toward the venue, not because I needed to, but because something told me to pause, to let the moment unfold a little further before moving on completely. The red light ahead cast a steady glow across the dashboard, bathing everything in a muted, almost unreal shade. My phone vibrated again, longer this time, more insistent. I glanced down briefly without reaching for it. Rachel's name filled the screen once more. This time, I let it ring. Until it stopped on its own. The silence that followed felt heavier, as if it carried the weight of everything she was trying to say without words. Then, almost immediately, another call came through. Different number. Likely the coordinator. Or perhaps the venue manager. Someone who had just realized that something essential was no longer in place. I did not need to hear their voices to understand the shift happening on the other side of town. I could see it clearly in my mind. The reception hall, filled with guests holding glasses, conversations mid-sentence, the soft music continuing in the background as confusion began to ripple through the room. A staff member approaching quietly, speaking to Rachel or her new husband with careful urgency. A whispered explanation. A request for clarification. The first signs that something was not as it should be. The light turned green, but I did not move right away. I sat there for just a second longer, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, my gaze fixed ahead. Then I pressed the accelerator gently and continued forward. I drove another block before pulling into a small parking area near a closed bookstore, the windows dark, the sign above the door faintly illuminated. I turned off the engine and let the quiet settle around me again. This time, I reached for my phone. There were 7 missed calls now. 3 voicemails. 4 messages. I opened the most recent one. Margaret, please answer me. They are saying there is an issue with the payment authorization. The venue is asking for confirmation and they will not proceed with the reception until it is resolved. I do not understand what is happening. You need to call me right now. I read it once, then let the screen dim again. The words were no longer urgent to me. They had already served their purpose. I opened the next message. Shorter this time. More direct. Did you do this? I watched the question sit there, simple and exposed, stripped of the earlier confusion. It was no longer about misunderstanding. It was about recognition. I leaned back slightly in the seat and looked out through the windshield, watching as a car passed by slowly, its headlights cutting briefly through the darkness before disappearing again. There was a time when I would have answered immediately, when I would have explained, justified, softened the edges of what had happened to make it easier for someone else to accept. But that instinct was gone now, replaced by something quieter, more grounded. Not anger. Not even satisfaction. Just clarity. I tapped the voicemail icon and listened to the next message. This one was not from Rachel. A man's voice, controlled but tense. Mrs. Collins, this is Andrew from the venue management team. We have encountered an issue with the financial authorization for tonight's event. We were informed that you are the primary account holder. We would appreciate your immediate assistance in resolving this matter. I let the message play through to the end, then closed it without responding. The title he used did not go unnoticed. Primary account holder. It was a detail that had been overlooked by everyone except the one person who had insisted it remain that way. I set the phone down again and rested my hands in my lap, my fingers loosely intertwined. Across town, the carefully planned evening was beginning to fracture in ways that could not be hidden much longer. Guests would start to notice the delay, the subtle tension in the staff, the absence of the usual flow that makes events like this feel effortless. Questions would be asked, answers would be demanded, and Rachel would be standing at the center of it, trying to hold everything together without understanding why it was slipping through her fingers. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, not to escape the situation, but to acknowledge it fully. When I opened them again, the world outside looked the same, but something inside me had settled completely into place. I reached for the phone one last time, my thumb hovering over Rachel's name. Not to answer. Not yet. Just to see it. Then I locked the screen and set it aside, letting the silence return once more as the night continued to unfold exactly as it needed to. I stayed in that quiet parking lot longer than I expected, watching the world move around me in small, ordinary ways while something far less ordinary continued to unravel just a few miles away. Another message appeared on my phone, then another, the screen lighting up briefly each time before dimming again. I did not rush to read them. I let them arrive, one after another, like distant echoes that no longer required my immediate attention. When I finally picked up the phone again, there were 11 missed calls. The numbers alone told a story. Urgency had turned into insistence. Confusion had sharpened into something closer to panic. I opened the latest voicemail, this one longer than the others. Rachel's voice filled the car again, but it had changed. The control she had tried to hold onto earlier was gone now, replaced by something uneven, strained. "Margaret, please listen to me. The coordinator is saying the final payment has been revoked. They are refusing to continue the reception unless this is fixed. People are asking questions. I do not know what you think you are doing, but this is my wedding. You cannot just walk away and leave everything like this." I listened without reacting, letting each word settle as it was spoken. When the message ended, the silence that followed felt even more complete than before. I placed the phone back on the passenger seat and looked out through the windshield, my gaze steady, my expression unchanged. For a long time, I had believed that showing up, supporting, and giving without question was what held a family together. That if you did enough, cared enough, sacrificed enough, it would be returned in some form, even if not immediately. But standing outside those doors earlier, hearing that quiet apology from someone who was not responsible, I had finally understood something much simpler. It was never about how much I gave. It was about how much they believed they could take. My phone vibrated again, this time with a different kind of message. A text from Daniel. "Everything has been processed. The accounts have been reassigned and all outgoing authorizations have been halted as requested. Let me know if you need anything further." I read it once, then locked the screen again, a small nod forming almost instinctively, even though no one could see it. The final piece had settled into place. Across town, that meant there would be no quick solution, no simple explanation that could smooth things over. The structure that had been quietly supporting the entire event had been removed, and now everything built on top of it would have to face that reality. I could imagine the room more clearly now. Guests shifting in their seats, glancing toward the front where staff members moved more quickly than before, their smiles thinner, their voices lower. A manager speaking in hushed tones to Rachel, her expression tightening as she began to understand that this was not a delay that could be brushed aside. The music would have stopped by now. The soft background elegance replaced by an awkward stillness that no one quite knew how to fill. Someone would ask if everything was all right. Someone else would check their phone, looking for answers that were not there yet. I leaned my head back slightly against the seat and closed my eyes for just a second, not out of fatigue, but out of acknowledgement. This was the moment where everything shifted completely. Not when I was turned away at the door, not when I signed those documents, but here, in the quiet aftermath, when the consequences reached the people who had chosen to ignore what I represented until it was no longer convenient to do so. When I opened my eyes again, I reached for my phone and scrolled through the messages one more time, stopping at Rachel's last question. "Did you do this?" My thumb hovered over the screen for a brief moment before I finally tapped to open a new message. I did not rush. I did not overthink the words. I simply typed, each letter appearing clearly, without hesitation. "Yes." I paused, looking at the single word, its simplicity, its finality. Then I added one more sentence. You made it very clear today that I was not part of this. I read it once, then pressed send. The message delivered instantly, the small confirmation appearing beneath it. I set the phone down again and let the silence return, deeper this time, more settled. Somewhere across town, that message would appear on Rachel's screen, arriving in the middle of confusion, of questions, of a celebration that had begun to fall apart. It would not fix anything. It was never meant to. It was simply the truth, stated without anger, without explanation, without apology. I reached forward and started the engine once more, the familiar hum filling the car as I shifted into drive. This time, I did not hesitate. I pulled out onto the road and continued forward, leaving behind the last place where I had waited, where I had watched, where I had allowed everything to unfold exactly as it needed to. The night stretched ahead of me, quiet and open, and for the first time that evening, it felt entirely mine. I drove without turning on the radio, letting the quiet of the night fill the space around me as the city lights stretched into long, blurred lines across the windshield. The road felt different now, not because it had changed, but because I had. Every intersection, every passing car, every distant glow of a street lamp seemed to exist at a calmer pace, as if the urgency that had once defined my role in other people's lives had finally loosened its hold. My phone rested face down on the passenger seat, still, silent for the first time in what felt like hours. Whatever storm had been building on the other side of town had already reached its peak. There was nothing more for me to witness, nothing more to manage, nothing more to correct. I had stepped out of it completely. After a few minutes, I turned into a quiet residential street lined with tall maple trees, their branches swaying gently in the cold evening air. The houses here were familiar, not because I had lived among them, but because they reminded me of a time when things felt simpler, when family gatherings were smaller, more genuine, less dependent on appearances. I slowed the car as I passed one house in particular, its porch light glowing warmly against the dark, a small detail that caught my attention for reasons I could not immediately explain. Then I continued on, eventually pulling into my own driveway. The house stood quietly, exactly as I had left it earlier that afternoon. No noise. No expectation. Just stillness. I turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. My reflection faintly visible in the darkened glass. The woman looking back at me did not appear shaken or defeated. If anything, she looked composed in a way that had taken years to understand. I stepped out of the car and closed the door gently behind me, the soft click echoing slightly in the quiet night. The cold air greeted me again, but it felt distant now, as if it could no longer reach the place it once had. I walked up the front steps, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. The warmth of the house settled around me immediately, familiar and steady. I placed my purse on the table near the entrance, removed my gloves, and hung my coat carefully in its usual place. Everything was exactly where it should be. Nothing had been disturbed. For a brief moment, I stood there in the quiet hallway, listening to the soft hum of the heating system, the subtle sounds of a home that had always been mine, always been under my care. Then I walked into the living room and turned on a small lamp, the warm light filling the space gently. I sat down on the couch, smoothing the fabric of my dress absent-mindedly, the same dress I had chosen for a celebration I was never meant to attend. The irony of it did not sting the way it might have before. It simply existed, another detail in a day that had revealed more than it had taken. My phone buzzed once more, breaking the silence, but I did not reach for it immediately. Instead, I leaned back slightly and let my gaze rest on the framed photographs lining the shelf across the room. There were pictures of holidays, birthdays, quiet moments captured without intention. Rachel was in many of them, smiling, standing close, looking like someone I once believed I understood completely. I studied those images for a moment longer, then looked away. When I finally reached for the phone, the screen lit up with a series of messages that no longer carried the same urgency they once had. Rachel's name appeared again, along with several others, unfamiliar numbers, likely people trying to make sense of a situation that had moved beyond their control. I opened one of her messages slowly. The tone had shifted again, no longer sharp, no longer demanding. This one was shorter, almost uncertain. "Margaret, please, just tell me what you want." I read the words carefully, letting them settle without reacting immediately. It was a different kind of question now. Not what happened. Not why. But what do you want? I placed the phone down beside me and let out a slow, quiet breath, my eyes moving back to the soft light filling the room. For so long, the answer to that question had been simple. I wanted peace. I wanted respect. I wanted to belong. But tonight had made something else very clear. Those things could not be given by someone who did not recognize their value in the first place. I picked up the phone again, not to respond, but simply to hold it, feeling its weight in my hand. Then I set it back down, untouched, unanswered. The room remained quiet, steady, unchanged. And for the first time in a very long while, I realized that I did not need to say anything at all. I did not respond that night. I left the message sitting there on the screen, unanswered, not out of hesitation, but out of understanding. Some questions do not deserve immediate answers, especially when they are asked too late. I turned off the lamp beside me and let the room settle into a softer light, the kind that comes from familiarity rather than intention. The house felt steady, grounded, untouched by everything that had unfolded just hours before. I moved through it slowly, almost instinctively, straightening a cushion, adjusting a frame on the wall, small actions that required no thought but carried a quiet sense of control. When I finally made my way to the kitchen, I poured myself a glass of water and stood by the counter, looking out at the darkened backyard. The reflection in the window showed me clearly now, not blurred or uncertain, but defined. I did not look like someone who had lost something. I looked like someone who had finally stopped pretending not to see it. My phone remained in the living room, silent for a while, then vibrating again, then silent once more. I did not go back for it right away. I let the night move forward without interruption, letting whatever needed to settle on its own. When I eventually returned and picked up the phone again, the messages had slowed. The urgency had passed. What remained was something quieter, more uncertain. I opened the last message Rachel had sent. It was different from the others. There was no demand, no accusation. Just a simple line. "I did not think you would actually do it." I read it carefully, letting each word rest exactly where it was meant to. Then I sat down, holding the phone loosely in my hand, and for the first time that evening, I allowed myself to think about her, not as the bride standing in a room filled with confusion, but as the sister I had known for most of my life. The one who used to call me when she needed advice, who leaned on me when things fell apart, who trusted me to hold everything together when she could not. I did not deny that version of her existed. It had. But it had not been the whole story. It never was. I placed the phone down beside me and leaned back into the couch, my eyes drifting to the photographs once more. There was one in particular that caught my attention this time. Rachel and I standing side by side, years ago, both smiling, both certain of something that no longer held the same meaning. I studied it for a moment, then reached forward and turned it slightly, not to hide it, but to change its place among the others. Some things do not need to be erased. They just need to be seen for what they are. The house remained quiet, the kind of quiet that does not feel empty, but complete. Outside, the wind moved gently through the trees, a soft, steady sound that carried through the night without urgency. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting that sound settle into the space around me, into the space within me. When I opened them again, I reached for the phone one last time. Not because I felt compelled to respond, but because I had something simple to say. I opened a new message, my fingers moving slowly, deliberately, each word placed without excess. I did not rush. I did not reconsider. I simply wrote what had already become clear. You did not think I would stop being who I needed to be. I paused, reading it once, then added one more line. But you showed me exactly where I stood. I sent the message and placed the phone back down, Screen facing up this time, no longer something to avoid, no longer something to manage. The response, whatever it might be, no longer carried weight in the same way. I stood up, walked to the window, and looked out once more at the stillness beyond the glass. Somewhere, the night was continuing for everyone else, conversations being replayed, questions being asked, explanations being attempted. But here, in this space, everything had already settled. I turned off the last light and let the room fall into darkness, not as an ending, but as a transition into something quieter, something clearer. And as I walked toward the hallway, my steps steady, unhurried, I realized that nothing about what had happened tonight would follow me the way it once might have. Not the cold. Not the closed door. Not even the silence that came after. Those things had belonged to a moment that had already passed. What remained was something else entirely. Something that did not need to be explained, justified, or revisited. Just understood. And left exactly where it belonged.